Hello, and welcome to Course 2 of Verifier Training for the Oregon Greenhouse Gas Reporting Program. In this course, we will be discussing general information in stationary combustion for permitted sources. If you have any questions about this course, please email us at 3pverify@deq.oregon.gov. This verification training is specific to stationary sources that maintain Title V and air contaminant discharge permits in the state of Oregon. Verification of reports with process emissions will be covered in additional trainings. The information presented in these slides does not replace a verifier's responsibility to know and abide by DEQ's greenhouse gas reporting program and third-party verification regulations. Please read the regulations, and if any information conflicts, the regulation takes precedence. For this training, we will be discussing general applicability, stationary combustion calculation methodology, multiple tier reporting, and the additional reporting requirements specific to Oregon DEQ. As described in OAR 340-215-30, sources that maintain a Title V or air contaminant discharge permit and produce greater than 2,500 metric tons of CO2 equivalent are required to submit greenhouse gas emissions data reports to the state of Oregon. Air contaminant discharge permits are issued for new sources, existing sources, and for sources that are undergoing a modification to their facility, equipment, or industrial processes. Air contaminant discharge permits are primarily used to regulate minor sources of air contaminant emissions, but are also required for any new major source or major modification at a major source. Title V operating permits are used to regulate major sources of air contaminant emissions. A major source of air emissions is defined as a source that has a potential to emit 100 tons of any criteria pollutant, or for emitters of hazardous pollutants, a major source has the potential to emit 10 tons of any single hazardous air pollutant, or 25 tons of any combination of hazardous air pollutants. The primary activities that result in reportable greenhouse gas emissions from sources that maintain air quality permits are the stationary combustion of fuels and the emissions produced in industrial processes. The greenhouse gas reporting threshold in Oregon is 2,500 metric tons of CO2 equivalent, which is much less than the reporting threshold for the EPA. The threshold assessment used to determine greenhouse gas emissions reporting obligations is the sum of the total combustion emissions and the total process emissions. Oregon DEQ implements greenhouse gas reporting requirements for stationary sources in all counties of the state except for Lane County. Lane Regional Air Protection Agency manages all aspects of greenhouse gas emissions reporting for the county and shares the emissions data with DEQ. Currently, there is one facility in Lane Regional Air Protection Agency's jurisdiction that is subject to the third-party verification requirements. Unless otherwise specified in OAR 340-215-105, reporters must calculate and report all greenhouse gas emissions for which there are quantification methodologies described in 40 CFR Part 98, Subpart C through UU. In addition to calculated GHG emissions, reporters are required to submit specific information including but not limited to fuel types, fuel sources, power generation, cogeneration, and for some facilities, an explanation of large changes in GHG emissions. These data are entered in the Additional Questions tab of the Greenhouse Gas Annual Report. There are also several additional reporting requirements specific to Oregon. This additional data is submitted and can be reviewed in the Additional Questions tab of the Greenhouse Gas Permitted Facilities Annual Report. The record-keeping requirements described in OAR 340-215-42 explain that sources that are subject to the third-party verification rules are required to maintain records and make the information available for 7 years. Included in OAR 340-215-42 are Oregon's new biomethane and hydrogen requirements, including book and claim accounting for these fuel types. These data should be verified as per the guidance found in OAR 340-272-470A. The entity should provide to you evidence demonstrating that the quantity of gas claimed was injected into a pipeline that is part of the natural gas transmission and distribution network connected to Oregon. They need to demonstrate the quantity of fuel that they are reporting, information about the production facility and purification process, feedstocks, and production methods. The entity should also provide evidence that demonstrates the full life cycle carbon intensity of the reported fuel. You should also verify that the entity has properly claimed the environmental attributes of the fuel and authenticate any purchases of gaseous or liquid biomass-derived fuels or hydrogen. In addition to specific record-keeping requirements for hydrogen, there are also specific reporting requirements in OAR 340-215-105 for hydrogen combustion and hydrogen that is used as feedstock. When the reported hydrogen replaces gaseous fuel that is combusted, the equivalent energy and volume of the gaseous fuel needs to be calculated and reported. If the reported hydrogen is displacing the gaseous fuel or feedstock used in non-combustion process, the amount of fuel or feedstock displaced needs to be calculated and reported. Annual emissions data reports are due to DEQ on March 31st each year. The report submission is made in your DEQ online by the responsible official at the reporting entity. If there are any changes in ownership or operational control of a facility during the reporting year, the entity is required to notify DEQ. Sources that have a threshold assessment equal to or greater than 25,000 metric tons of anthropogenic CO2 equivalent and are not covered by the exemptions are subject to third-party verification of their emissions data reports. If a facility's greenhouse gas emissions report is subject to third-party verification, all emissions and data contained in the annual emissions report are subject to verification, including emissions that are classified as biogenic. There are some exemptions that apply for verification purposes. Unless the entity is an electric company, it is not subject to verification if its emissions data report indicates emissions were 25,000 metric tons of CO2 equivalent or less, excluding emissions from biomass-derived fuels. Municipal solid waste landfills and interstate pipelines are also exempt from verification. All GHG pollutants from combustion of any fuel listed in Table C1 of Subpart C 240 CFR Part 98 and emissions from all fluorinated greenhouse gases listed in Table A1 of Subpart A 240 CFR Part 98 that are released to the environment during industrial processes must be reported to the state of Oregon, except for emissions produced from activities that are described in OAR 340-200-20 as being categorically insignificant. The state of Oregon has many types of industries that produce greenhouse gas emissions. Electricity generation, Subpart D, pulp and paper manufacturing, Subpart AA, and cement production, Subpart H, are the three largest stationary source emitters of greenhouse gas in the state. Oregon also has a large electronics manufacturing sector, which reports under Subpart I. Verifiers should be familiar with Oregon's applicability rules described in 340-215-30. The deferrals and exemption rules described in 340-215-32, and all other rules contained in OAR 340-215. Entities need to report to DEQ any emissions subject to 40 CFR Part 98, regardless of exemptions, though DEQ does allow for exemptions of categorically insignificant emissions under certain circumstances. DEQ also allows for deferral or exemption of specific processes, source categories, or specific types of emissions at DEQ's discretion. At this time, DEQ incorporates in reference the requirements from EPA that were adopted on December 9th, 2016. Updating these references will require new rulemaking for us and is a future consideration at this time. Regulated entities that are exempt from reporting under subpart MM or NN for stationary sources may have reporting obligations as fuel suppliers and in-state producers or as natural gas suppliers and in-state producers. Verifiers should contact DEQ greenhouse gas reporting staff with any questions regarding the applicability of subparts MM and NN when verifying greenhouse gas permitted facilities annual reports. Total GHG emissions is a sum of all listed greenhouse gases emitted multiplied by their individual global warming potential. Total greenhouse gas emissions is most often expressed in metric tons of CO2 equivalent. Currently, Oregon rules require the use of the global warming potentials published in the IPCC's fourth assessment, where the global warming potential for methane is 25 and the global warming potential for nitrous oxide is 298. Although the EPA has recently adopted rules requiring the use of global warming potentials published in the IPCC's fifth assessment report, Oregon rules still require the use of AR4 global warming potentials. There are differences in terminology used by the EPA and Oregon DEQ. As an example, the EPA makes a distinction of a facility being in actual physical contact or separated solely by a street, where in Oregon, a source can be separated by more than a public right-of-way. The terms facility and source are often used synonymously, but are distinct in their meaning. Reporters should calculate and report all GHG emissions for which there are quantification methodologies described in 40 CFR Part 98, Subpart C through UU. Oregon incorporates by reference in OAR 342.15 that the calculation methodology found in 40 CFR 98 shall be used. The reporting applicability requirements and the applicability provisions of 40 CFR Part 98 Subpart C through UU are not referenced or used by the state of Oregon. There are 4 tiers of calculation methodologies used to calculate greenhouse gas emissions from stationary combustion sources. Tier 1 uses the default emissions factors and default high heat values. Tier 2 uses the default emissions factors and annual weighted average high heat value in the calculations. Tier 3 uses the average carbon content and molecular weight in the calculations. And Tier 4 uses continuous emissions monitoring systems for emissions estimations. The calculators in the Greenhouse Gas Permitted Facilities Annual Report in YDO make the calculations for all reporting tiers. The accuracy of the calculation is dependent on the data entered into the report. All records and data submitted in the Greenhouse Gas Annual Report should be available and reviewed during the verification process. As applicable, the verifier should look at the fuel consumption and purchasing data, measured data and their measurement technologies, evidence of accuracy of meters and monitors, and any areas of missing data. Many errors found in stationary source combustion emissions reporting involve the fuel that is being combusted. Common errors that are made may include misreported fuel type, quantity of fuel, fuel measurement unit, or combinations of these errors. It is suggested that all fuel consumption data entered in the annual report are verified back to the evidence described in this slide to ensure proper data entry. Tier 1 calculation methodology is the most frequently used methodology of the 4 tiers. Tier 1 calculation methodology uses fuel-specific default emissions factors and high heat values in equations C1, C1A, and C1B that are described in Table C1 to Subpart C of 40 CFR 98. Because the emission factor and high heat value are dependent on the type of fuel that is being combusted, it is important to verify that all fuel-related data that was input into the greenhouse gas permitted facilities annual report was complete and accurate. Other areas to pay attention to for these types of report are listed on the slide. Tier 2 calculation methodologies, it uses fuel-specific default CO2 emissions factors found in Table C1 of Part 98 and calculated annual high heat values. Much like Tier 1 calculation methodology, Tier 2 uses a fuel-specific default CO2 emission factor from Table C1. However, the high heat value is calculated from monthly sampling data. If the results of the fuel sampling are received monthly or more frequently, the average annual high heat value shall be calculated according to the requirements of paragraph A2II of subpart C using equation C2b. When verifying Tier 2 emissions calculations, it is important to verify that the calculated annual high heat value and all other fuel data that was submitted in the GHG permitted facilities annual report was accurate and complete. Tier 3 calculation methodology relies on carbon content of the fuel to calculate greenhouse gas emissions. Due to the complexity and data requirements of Tier 3 calculations, this is the least commonly used methodology tier in the state. When verifying Tier 3 emission calculations, it is important to verify that the calculation used to determine the annual average carbon content of the fuel and all other fuel data that was submitted in the greenhouse gas permitted facilities annual report was accurate and complete. Continuous emissions monitoring systems, or CEMS, is an instrument or set of instruments that continuously measure actual emissions levels from stationary sources. The CEMS measures directly the pollutant of concern or measures a surrogate pollutant for the pollutant of concern. The pollutant of concern for greenhouse gas reporting requirements is CO2. The CO2 emissions data from the CEMS is entered directly into the annual GHG emissions report. The nitrous oxide and methane emissions from the combustion of specific fuels are calculated with equation C10 in 40 CFR 98. It is recommended to cross-check CO2 emissions using Tier 1 methodology. It is important to verify all CEMS testing documents, certifications, and QA procedures, both when verifying the report and while on site visit. Verifiers should ensure that the Tier 4 monitoring and QA/QC requirements guidance found in 40 CFR 98.34C is conducted, current, and documented. Whenever a quality assured value of a required parameter is unavailable, example, if a CEMS malfunctions during unit operation, or if a required fuel sample is not taken, a substitute data value for the missing parameter shall be used in the calculations as described in 40 CFR 98. You can find reference to the appropriate sections of CFR 98 on this slide. As previously discussed, the state of Oregon has additional reporting requirements that are submitted in the greenhouse gas permitted facilities annual emissions report that can be reviewed in the additional questions section of the report. These data elements are required and should be verified to be complete and accurate. There are also additional reporting requirements for specific subparts, including subpart H, cement production, subpart W, petroleum and natural gas systems, and subpart AA, pulp and paper manufacturing, that will be discussed in course 7 and 8 of these trainings. Reporters are required to submit calculations done outside of the reporting tool as attachments to the annual reports in YDO. A quick word about biogenic emissions. Emissions from biomass-derived fuels do not count on the threshold assessment for reporting or verification requirements. However, The emissions from the combustion of these fuels must be verified and can be calculated with any of the four methodologies and should be reported separately from other fuels. When verifying the reporting of mixtures of natural gas and biogas, the calculators in the greenhouse gas facility's annual emissions report will separate biogenic from anthropogenic CO2 emissions based on fuel types. If fuels are combusted as mixtures, reporters are required to create an emissions unit in the annual report for each fuel type combusted and report fuels separately. Finally, we will conclude today with where to find additional resources on reporting and verification for permitted stationary sources. There are many resources available for greenhouse gas emissions reporters and verifier. Links to some of Oregon DEQ and EPA's greenhouse gas emissions reporting resources are contained on this slide. This concludes course 2 of the verification training for stationary sources. Thank you for attending.